Nobody wanted the handmade trumpets until Miles Davis played one and changed everything forever. It was September 22nd, 1962, and master trumpet maker Giuseppe Benedetto was sitting in his small workshop in Queens, surrounded by 12 of the most beautiful handcrafted trumpets ever created, but he couldn't give them away. For 18 months, Giuseppe had poured his heart and soul into developing a revolutionary new approach to trumpet construction, using techniques passed down from his grandfather in Naples and combining them with innovations he had developed through decades of studying the acoustics of brass instruments. But every professional musician who tried his trumpets complained they were too different, too challenging, or not what audiences expected. Record companies wouldn't approve them, music stores refused to carry them, and even Giuseppe's own family thought he was wasting his time on instruments that would never be accepted by the musical establishment. Giuseppe had reached the point where he was considering destroying the instruments and returning to making conventional trumpets just to pay his bills. Then Miles Davis walked into his workshop, picked up one of the rejected trumpets, and played a single note that would transform not only Giuseppe's life, but also the entire approach to brass instrument manufacturing. What happened next shocked the music industry and proved that sometimes the most revolutionary innovations are rejected by everyone, until the right artist comes along and shows the world what true innovation actually sounds like. It was September 22nd, 1962, and Giuseppe Benedetto was experiencing the deepest professional and personal crisis of his life. For 43 years, he had been making brass instruments, learning the craft from his grandfather Salvatore in Naples, before immigrating to America in 1935 with dreams of creating the finest trumpets in the world and establishing a legacy that would honor his family's three-generation tradition of instrument making. Giuseppe's workshop in Queens was a testament to old-world craftsmanship combined with modern precision. Every tool had been carefully selected or handmade. Every technique had been refined through decades of practice, and every instrument that left his shop represented the culmination of knowledge passed down through three generations of Italian instrument makers who had served the greatest musicians of their time. The walls of his workshop were lined with photographs of famous musicians who had played Giuseppe's conventional instruments over the years. Jazz legends, classical virtuosos, and symphony orchestra principals who had trusted Giuseppe's craftsmanship for their most important performances. But none of those success stories could ease the pain of what Giuseppe was facing with his latest project. The 12 trumpets that currently sat unsold in his workshop represented something completely different. A revolutionary departure from traditional trumpet design that had taken him 18 months to perfect and had nearly bankrupted him in the process. These instruments embodied innovations that Giuseppe believed could transform how musicians approached brass playing, but they had been rejected by every professional who had encountered them. The inspiration for these revolutionary instruments had come to Giuseppe during a sleepless night in early 1961, when he had been thinking about the limitations of conventional trumpet design, while listening to a recording of a young trumpet player struggling with intonation problems that Giuseppe knew were caused not by the musician's technique, but by inherent limitations in traditional instrument construction. Traditional trumpets, Giuseppe realized, were built according to specifications that had been established in the 19th century and had remained essentially unchanged for over 100 years. While they produced the familiar trumpet sound that audiences expected, they also imposed restrictions on players' ability to express subtle musical ideas, forced compromises in intonation across different registers, and limited dynamic range in ways that prevented musicians from achieving their full artistic potential. Giuseppe had become convinced that brass instruments could be completely redesigned to offer greater flexibility, improved intonation across all registers, more responsive dynamics, and enhance tonal possibilities without sacrificing the essential character of the trumpet sound that made the instrument so beloved by musicians and audiences alike. His new design incorporated radical changes to the bore dimensions, valve construction, bell shape, and internal acoustics that would theoretically allow for more nuanced musical expression while solving long-standing technical problems that had plagued trumpet players for generations. Giuseppe had tested and refined every aspect of his design, creating prototypes, measuring acoustical properties, and making countless adjustments until he achieved what he believed was a genuine breakthrough in brass instrument technology. The problem was that every professional musician who tried these innovative instruments found them challenging to play and dramatically different from what they were accustomed to. The response had been uniformly negative, with players complaining that the instruments required them to modify their embouchure, adjust their breathing technique, and change their approach to articulation in ways that felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Established trumpet players were reluctant to invest time in learning new techniques when their careers depended on consistent performance using familiar equipment. They viewed Giuseppe's innovations not as improvements, but as obstacles that threatened their professional security and artistic comfort. Music store owners had been equally skeptical and commercially conservative, arguing that customers wanted instruments that looked and sounded like traditional trumpets, not experimental designs that might confuse or disappoint buyers who expected familiar characteristics. Store managers insisted that unusual instruments were difficult to sell and represented poor inventory investments. Record companies had been even more resistant, insisting that their artists use familiar-sounding instruments that would meet audience expectations and radio programming requirements. A&R executives expressed concern that unusual trumpet sounds might make recordings less commercially viable and harder to market to mainstream audiences. Giuseppe's wife Maria had been supportive, but increasingly concerned about the financial strain that the project was placing on their family. Giuseppe had invested nearly all of their life savings in materials, development costs, and workshop modifications. And with no sales to show for his efforts after 18 months, they were facing the very real possibility that he would have to abandon the project entirely and return to making conventional instruments just to survive financially. Giuseppe, Maria had said to him that September morning, maybe it's time to accept that these instruments are too advanced for the current market. Perhaps musicians aren't ready for such dramatic innovation, and we need to think about our family's future. Giuseppe understood his wife's concern and appreciated her patience, but he remained convinced that his instruments represented a genuine advancement in brass instrument design that could benefit any musician willing to invest the time needed to master their enhanced capabilities. The problem, he believed, was not with the instruments themselves, but with the conservative mindset and risk-averse culture that dominated the music industry. That afternoon, Giuseppe was in his workshop, seriously considering whether to dismantle the unsold trumpets and salvage their valuable components for conventional instruments that he could actually sell, when he heard an unexpected knock at his workshop door. Miles Davis stood outside the workshop, having been directed there by Tony Williams, a young drummer who had heard about Giuseppe's experimental instruments through the New York jazz community's informal network of musicians, who were always searching for new sounds and innovative equipment. "Mr. Benedetto," Miles said when Giuseppe opened the door, "I heard you've been working on some revolutionary trumpet designs that are supposed to be completely different from anything else available. I'd like to see what you've been developing." Giuseppe was surprised but pleased to have such a prominent and innovative musician take interest in his work. Miles Davis was known throughout the music world as someone who was constantly pushing boundaries and experimenting with new approaches to sound and expression, making him exactly the kind of artist who might appreciate unconventional instruments. Giuseppe invited Miles into the workshop and began explaining his design philosophy and the specific innovations he had incorporated into the instruments. He described the theoretical advantages of his new approach, the technical challenges he had overcome, and the enhanced musical possibilities that the instruments were designed to provide. Miles listened carefully and thoughtfully as Giuseppe described his work, asking intelligent questions about construction techniques, acoustical principles, and the practical implications of the design changes. But what really interested Miles was the opportunity to actually play the instruments and evaluate their sound, responsiveness, and musical potential firsthand. "May I try one?" Miles asked, indicating the row of handcrafted trumpets displayed on Giuseppe's workbench, each one representing months of careful work and refinement. Giuseppe handed Miles the trumpet that he considered his finest achievement, an instrument that incorporated all of his innovations and represented the culmination of 18 months of intensive development work, theoretical research, and practical experimentation. Miles examined the instrument carefully and methodically, noting the subtle but significant differences in construction and design that distinguished it from conventional trumpets. He studied the valve construction, tested the key action, examined the bore dimensions, and evaluated the overall balance and feel of the instrument. Then he raised it to his lips and played a single sustained note that immediately filled the workshop with a sound unlike anything Giuseppe had ever heard emerge from a trumpet, despite his years of experience creating and testing brass instruments. The note had all the fundamental characteristics of a traditional trumpet sound: the clarity, the projection, the unmistakable brass timbre that defined the instrument. But it also possessed entirely new qualities that Giuseppe had theorized about, but never actually heard realized in practice. The sound featured a richness of overtones that created unprecedented harmonic complexity, a precision of intonation that eliminated the slight pitch variations that plagued conventional trumpets, and a responsiveness to dynamic variation that allowed for incredibly subtle gradations of volume and intensity that had previously been impossible to achieve on a brass instrument. Miles continued playing, methodically exploring different registers, testing various techniques, and pushing the instrument through increasingly complex musical passages. With each phrase, it became clearer that the instrument was capable of musical expression that conventional trumpets simply could not achieve, and that Giuseppe's theoretical innovations were translating into practical musical advantages that could transform how musicians approached brass playing. The innovative design was allowing Miles to articulate musical ideas with a subtlety and nuance that had previously been impossible, to achieve perfect intonation in registers where conventional trumpets struggled with pitch accuracy, and to create dynamic effects that opened up entirely new possibilities for musical expression and artistic communication. "This is absolutely extraordinary," Miles said after playing for nearly an hour, exploring every aspect of the instrument's capabilities. "These instruments don't just sound different, they allow me to express musical ideas that I've never been able to communicate before. This is genuinely revolutionary." Giuseppe was overcome with emotion, realizing that Miles had immediately understood what he had been trying to achieve, and had demonstrated the instrument's potential in ways that no other musician had been able to grasp or appreciate. Every other player who has tried these instruments complained that they were too difficult or too different, Giuseppe explained, his voice reflecting months of disappointment and frustration. They all said the instruments required too much adjustment to their established playing techniques and weren't worth the effort to learn. Miles smiled and responded with characteristic directness and insight. "That's because they were trying to play these instruments exactly like conventional trumpets, using techniques that were developed for inferior technology. These require a different approach and an open mind. But once you understand what they can do and adapt your technique accordingly, you realize they're capable of musical expression that goes far beyond what traditional instruments can offer any musician." Miles spent the next 4 hours in Giuseppe's workshop, systematically playing all 12 of the handcrafted instruments and exploring their different characteristics and specific capabilities. Each instrument had subtle variations that Giuseppe had incorporated to test different aspects of his design theories, and Miles was able to identify and appreciate the unique qualities of each one, providing feedback that helped Giuseppe understand how his innovations were functioning in practice. "I want to buy 6 of these instruments immediately," Miles announced, "and I want to commission you to create additional instruments based on modifications and refinements we discuss." This represents the future of trumpet design and musical expression. Giuseppe was completely stunned by this response. After 18 months of rejection, discouragement, and financial worry, the most innovative and respected musician in jazz was not only endorsing his work, but was willing to invest substantial money in it and collaborate on further development. The partnership that emerged between Miles and Giuseppe revolutionized both of their careers and influenced the entire music industry. Miles's use of the handcrafted instruments on his subsequent recordings introduced audiences to new possibilities for trumpet sound and expression, while Giuseppe's workshop became the destination for musicians who were seeking instruments that offered greater expressive potential and superior technical capabilities. The first recording that Miles made using one of Giuseppe's instruments was a revelation that shocked critics and musicians alike. The enhanced responsiveness and tonal qualities of the handmade trumpet allowed Miles to explore musical ideas that had previously been limited by the constraints of conventional instrument design, creating sounds and effects that expanded the vocabulary of jazz expression. Music critics who heard the recording were initially puzzled by the unfamiliar qualities of Miles's trumpet sound. But as they became accustomed to the new tonal palette and understood the musical possibilities it represented, they began to recognize that they were hearing an expansion of musical possibilities that represented a genuine advancement in instrumental technology. Other prominent musicians began seeking out Giuseppe's instruments, eager to experience the enhanced expressive capabilities that Miles had demonstrated, and hoping to incorporate similar innovations into their own musical approaches. Word spread rapidly through the jazz community that a master craftsman in Queens was creating instruments that could transform a player's musical possibilities. Giuseppe's workshop became a pilgrimage site for serious trumpet players from around the world who were interested in pushing the boundaries of their musical expression and exploring new possibilities for artistic communication. The waiting list for his instruments grew to over 2 years, and Giuseppe was forced to expand his operation and train additional craftsmen to meet the overwhelming demand. The success also vindicated Giuseppe's belief in the importance of innovation and superior craftsmanship in instrument design. His instruments proved that there was a substantial market for advanced quality and revolutionary design when they were presented to musicians who were capable of appreciating and utilizing their enhanced capabilities. Miles's endorsement also influenced the broader music industry's attitude toward instrument innovation and experimental design. Record companies began to recognize that unique instrumental sounds could be commercially valuable and artistically significant, and music stores started to carry more diverse and experimental instrument designs. The collaboration between Miles and Giuseppe continued for many years, with Giuseppe creating custom instruments tailored to Miles's evolving musical needs and artistic vision. Each new instrument incorporated refinements and innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in brass instrument design and musical expression. Giuseppe's techniques and design principles also influenced other instrument makers around the world, who began incorporating his innovations into their own work and developing new approaches to instrument construction. The entire field of brass instrument manufacturing was elevated by the standards of craftsmanship and innovation that Giuseppe had established. Music educators began using Giuseppe's instruments as examples of how traditional craftsmanship could be combined with innovative design to create tools that expanded rather than limited musical expression. The instruments became part of discussions about the relationship between technology, artistry, and musical communication. The story of Giuseppe's struggle and eventual success became legendary among craftsmen and artists who were pursuing innovative work in traditional fields. The partnership with Miles demonstrated that revolutionary ideas could find acceptance and commercial success when they were presented to people who were capable of recognizing their value and potential. Contemporary instrument makers continue to study Giuseppe's techniques and design principles, recognizing that his work established new standards for what was possible in brass instrument construction and opened up new possibilities for musical expression that continue to influence musicians today. Giuseppe's workshop in Queens became a historical site for music enthusiasts who wanted to understand how revolutionary instrument design had contributed to the evolution of jazz and contemporary music. The tools and techniques that Giuseppe developed continue to influence instrument makers and musicians around the world. The financial success that followed Miles's endorsement allowed Giuseppe to pursue even more ambitious projects and to train a new generation of craftsmen in his innovative techniques and design principles. His legacy extended far beyond the instruments he created, to include the knowledge and skills he passed on to others. Years later, Giuseppe would describe his meeting with Miles as the moment when his life's work was finally understood and appreciated. "For 18 months, I thought I had created instruments that nobody wanted," he said. "But Miles showed me that I had created instruments that nobody else understood." Miles, for his part, credited Giuseppe's instruments with enabling him to achieve new levels of musical expression and artistic satisfaction. "Giuseppe didn't just make instruments," Miles said. "He made tools for musical ideas that hadn't been invented yet." The transformation of both Giuseppe and Miles through their collaboration became a powerful example of how artistic partnerships could serve as catalysts for individual growth and creative breakthrough. Their relationship demonstrated that the most valuable innovations often emerged when traditional craftsmanship met visionary artistry in an environment of mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. The broader cultural impact of their partnership extended beyond the music industry to influence discussions about innovation, tradition, and the relationship between artistry and technology in all creative fields. The story became a case study in how revolutionary ideas required not just brilliant conception, but also the right advocate to demonstrate their value. Giuseppe's instruments also influenced the development of new educational approaches in music schools and conservatories. Educators began recognizing that traditional instrument limitations had been constraining musical expression, and that students could benefit from exposure to instruments designed specifically to expand rather than limit their artistic possibilities. The psychological impact of Miles's endorsement on Giuseppe was transformative and lasting. After months of self-doubt and financial anxiety, Giuseppe regained his confidence in his abilities as an innovator and craftsman. The validation from such a respected musician confirmed that his intuitions about instrument design had been correct all along. The recording industry's response to Miles's use of Giuseppe's instruments also demonstrated how technological innovation could drive artistic evolution. Record executives began actively seeking out musicians who were using innovative equipment, recognizing that unique sounds could create competitive advantages in an increasingly crowded marketplace. The waiting list for Giuseppe's instruments eventually included musicians from every genre and geographical region, proving that the desire for enhanced musical expression transcended stylistic boundaries. Classical musicians, jazz artists, pop performers, and experimental composers all recognized the value of instruments that could expand their expressive capabilities. The partnership between Giuseppe and Miles also influenced other craftsmen and artists to pursue more ambitious collaborations. The story demonstrated that traditional skills and contemporary vision could combine to create innovations that neither could achieve independently, inspiring similar partnerships across different creative disciplines. If this story of innovation, rejected by everyone until the right artist came along, the power of perseverance in pursuing revolutionary ideas, and how true genius recognizes authentic advancement moved you. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with any craftsperson pursuing innovative work, any artist seeking unique tools for expression, or anyone who believes that revolutionary ideas often need the right champion to find acceptance. Have you ever created something that others didn't understand until someone special recognized its value? Let us know in the comments.